Hi, welcome to the EvilTester show. In this show, we're going to talk about workarounds, how you can use them for your testing, how they support you with your automating, and how you just use them just to bypass processes that are getting in your way. My name is Alan Richardson. You can find me at eviltester.com. Now, I realized recently that workarounds have been so tremendously important to my approach to testing. Everything that I've done in testing, the way that I automate, the way that I approach things. And I was reminded this recently because I was using a new tool for helping me with social media. It's a tool that publishes you write an article once and it publishes it on Facebook and Medium and a bunch of other places. So I'll be syndicating my content in more places. One of the things it does is it has the notion of a primary source, but the primary sources that it have are not the ones that I use. Like I have static websites as my primary source. I have Blogger from my blogs. They're not marked as primary sources in this tool, so it's hard to publish because the blog post I want to be the canonical one doesn't exist yet because it hasn't been published by the tool. So I looked around at what can I do to work around this, and the tool has an API. And the API can be set as the primary source. So I wrote a very tiny script in PHP that it could point to the API at, create some custom fields in the tool so that the tool basically says to the API, have you published? And the API goes, yes, of course, because it's just a stub. And then it sets the URL, then everything else can happen. And it's just a workaround. And I was thinking, I need programming skills to be able to do that. I need to be able to think as a developer to come up with a solution. But would I have even started down that road if it hadn't been for my testing skills? Because workarounds have been key to so many approaches that I've had to do in testing. So much so that the first conference talk that I tried to submit, and I tried to submit it with Neil McCarthy, we put in a dual conference, I think it was to Eurostar. It was called Don't Let Tools Limit Your Testing, and it was all about workarounds and how we should know what we want to do, then we should use the tools, but we should customize the tools, we should build things using the APIs, work around them to not be forced into doing things the way that the tool process does, but to use the tool the way that we want, to not let ourselves be limited by the tools. And that was an important point then. I think it's an important point now, it underpins what I do, and it's a talk that wasn't accepted, which is fine, because not all your talks are going to be accepted, and you learn from that. But it didn't stop me doing workarounds. So I'm going to try and give you some examples so that you have some concrete examples. So I remember there was a test management tool that we were using back in the day when people still wrote test cases and scripts and we cross-referenced everything. This was a desktop-based tool, sat on our desktops, didn't have an API, didn't have any hooks, didn't have any way of automating this. It was a purely manual type tool that we had to use. But because multiple people were using it at the same time, there was the notion of a server. A server was a database. Now there were reports that I wanted to generate, but I couldn't. There were things I couldn't do. I wouldn't let this tool limit my testing. I thought if I had access to the database, even just read-only access, I could do what I need to do in that tool. But the database administrator wouldn't give us the password, and that's often a problem that we have. We can't get access to the environments we want. We can't get access to the databases, to the tools, to whatever else. Now we can either just stop there, or we can find workarounds. Now remember, I'm trying to write something which is a workaround to a process anyway, and now I have to do a new workaround to get access to the tool to let me build my workaround. But that's what happens. We compound things on top of each other. And what I noticed was when I went off to the tool website and read the support documentation, I found the default admin password. So I tried the default admin password. The default admin password hadn't been changed because it's the default admin password to the database, not the tool. The tool admin password had been changed, not the database one. So I had database access, which is great. So that meant I could spend half a day building up a quick prototype of accessing the database, pulling the information we needed out, presenting it in a way. Then I showed people this is what we can do if we have access to the database. The database administrator said, you're not getting access to the database. And the management said, we're going to keep the access because this report is useful. We've got something we can use and build on. And so sometimes that's what we have to do. We have to find a workaround bypass certain controls, you might get in trouble, right? You got to be aware that you might get in trouble because you're bypassing things. And it really depends where the power in an organization is as to whether that's going to work for you or not. And I'm not suggesting you have to be prepared to be sacked for whatever you do, but there's a nuance. I mean, people say it's better to ask for forgiveness rather than permission. It's not always true. Sometimes it's better to ask for permission. But that notion of taking control and being more entrepreneurial about your approach can get things done. But you have to be careful, because remember, there's a risk. There's a risk to you and your career and your job personally if you don't necessarily have management backing as you're doing this. But that worked. I've been in environments where we had locked down machines. They give you a machine, they say, you shall not install anything. You go, I really need some tools for my work. No, you must not do your work because you must not install anything. Those are kind of nightmare environments to work in. And 2 workarounds. One of them I don't recommend. We used to bring in USB sticks with the tools we needed as portable apps. So in theory, we weren't really installing anything. We were putting a USB stick in. I think that's kind of not quite going against the spirit of what they wanted, but it helped us get the job done, or virtual machines on there. Don't recommend that. Certainly in today's world where people have got virus checkers and they stop things, then they might lock the USB sticks down. But one of the things that they didn't lock down was they gave everyone Microsoft Office. Because no one can do anything with Microsoft Office. People can do anything with Microsoft Office because as a scripting language. So as soon as you learned, in those days it was VBA, you could build your own tools. And you didn't have to build a lot of a GUI because you were building it in Excel. So you put all the values in a form, have a button runs some macro, and it does whatever you need. I built tools to lock files, generate data, move things from place to place, send messages, and loads of stuff. Right, because it's a programming language and it's incredibly flexible. And if you have the skills to program, the amount of workarounds that open up become massive. So learning the capabilities of the tools that you use is really important. And not just from a, can I extend this with plugins? Can I program this? Sometimes that will make API calls to something else. Sometimes it will have plugins that you can use that someone else has built. Sometimes it will be a scripting interface. If you're using something like Fiddler, the entire configuration is a scripting interface, and you can do a lot in there. I mean, I've written groovy scripts in FreeMind and FreePlane to extend it to give me extra functionality. You could use, if you're not a programmer, something like Zapier or IFTTT to make calls when some event happens and just chain up programs that were there. I mean, that's the Unix philosophy. Once you know some of the command line tools, you just chain all the command line tools together and you get your work done. So if you're on Linux, chances are you've got a lot of tools that you can use already. You may not be aware of them. So learning the capabilities of the operating system and the tools you've got is really useful. Nowadays, some tools are really, really powerful. The Google Spreadsheets app, you can script that in JavaScript. I've built REST APIs in the Google spreadsheet that I've used commercially. So when previous systems I've been working on, when someone buys something, there's a hook, it calls my spreadsheet, the API in the spreadsheet, which tracks things and then sends me messages, and then I can authorize stuff. You can build hugely complicated workflows with this with very little glue code. So you may have to learn programming to do some of these technical things, but the amount of programming you have to learn is really small. It doesn't have to be great code. I released on GitHub the code that I used for the stuff that I was talking right at the start with Story Chief. I've just released that. You can see how simple the script is. It's not a complicated set of code. And the latest FreePlane macro that I've created, which exports just the node text as markdown. That's really simple, and it's on GitHub. You can see all this stuff if you're really interested in it. But the technical examples that I've used do require programming skills. But very often the workarounds that have really made a difference have been process workarounds, right? Just when the process is getting in the way and the process police are saying we must do X, Y, Z, but that's getting in the way of actually doing the work. And there's an art to bending the rules. The biggest art comes from making sure that what you're doing actually adds value, right? You can get away with a lot of things if the outcome actually adds value and demonstrates that it's more effective or efficient than the heavyweight process. Doesn't always work, but that convincer of, look, it actually works is pretty convincing most of the time. And sometimes you have to stick to the spirit rather than the letter of the law. But again, you're taking your career or your job in your hands unless you get management approval when you do this. So it might get you in trouble. But some of the big examples of this are templates, standard document templates. One of the biggest workarounds I've ever had to do most consistently are figuring out how to make templates work for me. There's an interesting thing. Information theory leads on to compression techniques and how we compress data and information. Now, all the boilerplate documentation that's in templates could be compressed to like a tiny bite, right? I don't know, standard page set 1, like, I don't know, 3 words that actually maps onto 6 pages of boilerplate in your document. Because it's consistent, it's the same, information theory would allow us to compress that down. So it's really redundant. It's not really relevant to the document. But as people, it's in the document. We have to read it because we don't know yet what is relevant and what is not. So we have to read through all of this. So inevitably people then don't read the documents properly when they have a lot of boilerplate. So one of the things that I've done in the past is move a lot of the boilerplate into the appendice, right? Because a lot of your introductions have boilerplate. Just get that out into the appendice. Just stick it in there as standard boilerplate template. And process police, they're not happy, but there's not a lot they can do because it's in the document. And you're summarizing it up front for the managers so they know what to read. Then you split the sections out in the middle for stuff that is relevant to you. Because if you're producing documentation, it has to be relevant to the stakeholders, and you've got their managers, they're your stakeholders. You've got you're a really important stakeholder in these documents, and you've got the process police, but they're the least important, so you stick their stuff at the back. So learning how to create summaries and structure this stuff effectively, that's been a workaround I've used a lot in the olden days with formal templates, but we don't do that anymore, right? We don't do that anymore, so that wouldn't happen. Other tools, test management tools. In the olden days, you'd have test conditions, you cross-reference them with test cases, you write test scripts, then you have to write all the steps in the test scripts. That is hugely painful, takes a lot of time. If you have to make changes, it's a nightmare. So that's a process that was getting in the way. What I would very often do is I would look for the biggest text areas, correct? Because text areas are flexible. I tend to write most of my documentation now in Markdown, which is really useful because I can extract that and put it into various tools and it'll format as PDFs or HTML or whatever else. I didn't have those tools in the olden days, but I would still write in text, and I would find big areas of text so that I could write structured text to explain everything. So rather than write a test script that was split across a horrible non-spreadsheet type table form that was really hard to move and edit and manipulate, I just write a big set of text in the biggest text field we've got, which is probably the description field in the test case, and use that. And then if the tool forced me to have a test script so that I could mark this as executed, I would have a single step in that script that says, have you run the stuff in the description? Yes. Okay, done. And for your expected results, you could put in, I'm expecting the information in test scripts. And for your actual results, you could actually copy in the notes that you made during the testing so that you're justifying the work that you're doing. That's a tool that's trying to limit what we're doing, but we find a way around it. Now, we wouldn't do that anymore because we have agile tools and everything is stories and that's flexible, except when it isn't, right? Because you give people a flexible tool and they like to lock it down to certain roles, or they like to create workflows, or they like to put it into certain states where certain fields can only be filled in certain states, and then some are mandatory and some are not, and we can make this really complicated process when we want something lightweight. And again, what you do, or what you can do, is look for the text fields that are accessible to you. Very often the text fields are, if it's a story or a JIRA or whatever else, you've got a description. you could continue to add things in the description in the same way that you make exploratory test logs. Just put in the date in the description and add your notes. If there's no comment facility, date, comment, just write your stuff. Add attachments that represent the execution that you're doing. Add attachments for the test sessions. Figure a way of bending the tool to what you need. And with something like Jira, I have frequently tried to avoid complicated processes, and I have used the description field because no one writes anything down. Therefore, the description field is empty. So it's just sitting there waiting for me to write up my notes about what I tested. Or the comments on the Jira itself, put in the comments to describe the testing you did at a certain point. They're automatically timestamped, so you know what date it is, and you're maintaining logs that way. And that's using the tool without any special configuration to support an ongoing process without heavy duty work and complications. Now, when we do look at our testing specifically, our actual testing process, you might find a blocking bug, right? There's certain scenarios you want to test, bug right in the middle of there, you can't test the rest of it. So very often we'll look for workarounds. How can I get around this bug? So we find ways around it by injecting data in the database so we don't have to follow that path. And we can use the API to take the path forward without using the GUI. Or we can go directly to a particular URL rather than traversing through the system GUI because there's a blockage that doesn't let us do that. But we just go directly there. All of those things are workarounds. And as soon as you get used to using those, not just for working around bugs, you can start to apply those directly into your test process so that you don't log in via the GUI all the time. What you do is you submit the details in the form encoding to the back end, you get the session cookie, then you inject the session cookie into your browser. You've logged in without going through the login flow. You jump directly to particular URLs. When you want a new session in your browser, you don't close the browser down and bring it up again because that can take time. You just clear all the cookies down, start up a new session using the API, inject your cookies in. Now, all these workarounds come with risk, but it's a technical risk. So you can evaluate it, understand it from a technical point of view as a team to decide whether it is worth doing or not. But the biggest point here is workarounds have been so fundamental to my testing life, the approach to processes, the way we've used tools, the way that I automate things. I take it for granted that I will do those. And I learn a lot of the times the technology that I'm testing or working with so that I can implement these workarounds, so that I can assess the risk of these workarounds from a technical perspective to enable me to justify their usage, right? Because if your test cases or test scripts or test scenarios or automated execution or whatever word you want to use, if those are taking a long time because you're traversing through the GUI from start to middle, if you could jump in the middle, if you can justify jumping in the middle from a technical perspective so that people understand that the risk is low, that might speed up your execution without needing to have parallel flows or any complicated add-ons to your execution process. Workarounds can help us do things more efficiently and effectively. Now, I've only covered, 5 workaround examples in here, but there are loads. And when I was starting to think this through, I was like, well, which ones should I pick? My God, there's so many. I imagine as an exercise, if you just sat down and thought about the workarounds that you've had to use, either bypassing processes, sneaking in a door without using your pass, figuring ways of getting to something, figure out ways of convincing someone to do something that you weren't supposed to do, you probably have a load of examples of workarounds you've used in the past. And that can then give you the confidence to then take this as a viable technique forward so that you look for workarounds in your workplace and in your life. Because this is a life hack. If you know what outcome you want and stuff just gets in your way, you find the workarounds that allow you to keep pushing forward so that you don't let things limit your outcomes. You find workarounds because you know where you're going, you keep pushing it, you stack workarounds on workarounds if you need to so that you can get the results you want. All of this ties together, because the more that we can make the testing that we do have the life lessons, take the lessons from testing into our life, all of this helps because it becomes one thing. So don't let any of this stuff limit you. You know how to use the workarounds, you know how to find them. I use them all the time, and this is just a reminder that workarounds are so fundamental to what we do. It's a useful concept to embrace and keep at the forefront of our mind. So thanks for tuning in. I don't know if you're listening to this on a podcast, in which case I hope you're subscribing through whatever podcast app you use, or subscribe on YouTube where you can see this, because we release this as a video and an audio podcast. And sign up for our blog over on EvilTester.com. And I'll see you on the internet at some point.